This week on Solitary, Poor, Nasty, Brutish, and Short, Scott interviews Dr. Harold Carter, a historian at Oxford University specializing in economic and social history, as well as a farmer and community philanthropy leader. He previously worked as a strategy consultant, baker, and think tank director before moving into academia and public service. In addition to his academic work, he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and Commerce. Enjoy!
Harold Carter, thank you so much for coming on to the show. My first question is about your course, Death of a Dream. What was that dream exactly, and when did it start to die?
The dream was that you would be able to make not just a welfare state that looked after people, which on the whole worked and happened successfully, but that you would change the nature of your community to make it a better and a happier place by virtue of all of those changes. There was a very optimistic set of assumptions about human nature. And that's the dream that perhaps didn't turn out quite the way that people expected. And I think it started to die because there were some contradictions which were not noticed at the stage at which people set it up. I mean, people always, whatever you're starting, you start it on the basis of a legend or a myth or a set of assumptions, and that's never complete. But in this particular case, some of those assumptions about human beings and the way in which the good in them would inevitably be released when some of the social constraints were removed wasn't necessarily carried through in full. And clearly it had some successes, but it also had some failures. And I'd say that when it began to fall apart was probably much earlier than the narrative about the welfare state generally believes it to have been, because the welfare state narrative is all about running into problems as it runs out of money in the 60s and 70s, and as you get assorted financial crises and so on, plus a little bit about immigration putting stresses on. I mean, those are the stories that people tell about what caused it to begin to fray at the edges. But actually, I think the problem really happens when you get individualism in the sense of libertarian individualism emerging in the 1960s with, at that point on the left, let it all hang out hippies, and then a little bit later with fanatics of the right who believe also in individualism, but of a different sort, and who don't really believe in the community as an existing entity.
That's just, if Thatcher said, right? There is no community. There's individuals and families.
Yes, she didn't mean it quite like that, I don't think. The community is made up of individuals and families. She wasn't saying that you don't have a duty to one another. I think she would have accepted that people did have a duty to one another. But I think if you take some of the more extreme market liberals, which Mrs. Thatcher wasn't, then you do begin to move in that direction, and you end up with all sorts of problems because you need common values, common standards to underpin the way in which people behave. In particular, you need that when it comes to creating common goods like health or education, in particular housing, where actually you've got to ration, you've got to allocate it to some people and not to other people. And you don't know in advance what is going to be judged to be fair. In the 40s and 50s, people kind of assumed that all reasonable people would agree on orders of priorities. But once that comes into the 60s, with people saying, my opinion is as good as yours, everybody has equal claims, then it becomes impossible to prioritize.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot that I'd like to jump into. The first thing that comes to mind is Lincoln's second inaugural address, at the end of which he makes a kind of wish, or he expresses a hope that the better angels of our nature shall prevail. And, fast forward to the present day, Steven Pinker wrote this book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. I suppose one of the problems you're describing is that the better angels of our nature do not always win. They are not always the angels which.
No, that isn't the problem. The problem is much more serious than that. The problem is that we've got lots of different notions of better.
Well, let's talk about human nature. What were the foundational assumptions about human nature that went into the input of this project and which proved to be inaccurate? Is it, the desire to help your neighbor, the desire for a large, thriving middle class, the desire to feel relativistically successful?
I think the core assumption was that people would be nice to each other. Not really
when has that
very
ever
much
worked?
more than that. The assumption was that everybody wanted fair play. Everybody wanted decent behavior, whatever that may be.
But Harold, this is insane. This is an insane assumption.
Not really. I mean, it's the core assumption that we actually base our society on. If you didn't,
it's absolutely not. Otherwise, there wouldn't be laws which restrict the way that we act.
But the point is that laws can't specify everything. If you think about a work to rule, a work to rule in an industrial dispute, we only do what it says in the contract. Immediately, the organization
fails,
grinds to a halt.
Yeah.
There
were protests at Ford factories where workers sort of protested by doing only what was in the rule book.
Absolutely. And it's a very standard industrial relations tactic. If you apply it in the health service, then nothing happens. In fact, there was a very funny moment where the last New Labour government, the 97 Blair government, decided that consultants in the health service were being grossly overpaid and should only be paid for the work that they did. And the consultant said, "What, really? Thank you." And immediately started charging overtime for all the work that they had been doing unpaid. But the point is that any society depends actually most of the time on quite high levels of interpersonal trust.
Sure.
So yes, of course you have rules to stop people defecting, because if you've got a high trust society, then the advantages of being a defector and cheating are enormous. People leave their doors open, so you go in and you steal their stuff. And then it stops being a high trust society. But actually, if you assume the worst, if you assume that people are bad and that you always have to have security and always have to have locked doors and you always have to have gated communities, then the world really begins to fall apart, especially because people then become unwilling to pay for things that benefit other people. So I think the core assumption was that people are, broadly speaking, altruistic if they get a chance. And they probably are. But the snag is that when you've got loads of different competing goods, it's very hard. You don't think you're being unfair when you go out for yourself, if you think that the other guys are cheating on the other side. And if everybody disagrees about what is good, then it's okay to cheat. Let me give you a concrete example. Admissions to this university.
Sure.
Okay. A long time ago, sort of 1930,
okay,
it probably depended on whether your schoolmaster knew the admissions tutor and whether you were a good chap and whether you could catch a rugby ball.
Fair enough.
That's one way of admitting people. In America, I believe we call these sports scholarships, and they're quite common. So move on to the notion that it should be open to everybody of equal talent. Well, at that stage, which is roughly when I turned up, and there was a large proportion of people coming from state grammar schools, which were selective state schools, they did fairly well on the entrance exams, but the entrance papers consisted of 6 separate 3-hour papers, including translation from 2 foreign languages. And I think one general paper, which was rather like the All Souls fellowship exam where you were given 1 or 2 words
Yeah.
that you could write an essay about.
Yeah. I would have loved to have
It
sit
would have
that
been
exam.
great.
Yeah.
And it was fun, actually. It was a fun set of exams. But then people start saying, but it's only if you've been to a certain sort of school and you've had a certain sort of educational background that you can admit people on the basis of these competitive exams. So let's do things that abolish these special exams and just admit people on the basis of their A-level results. That's the top level
The
high school
GCSEs
graduation.
or whatever. Yeah.
High school graduation results, which would have been in 2 or 3 specialized subjects, maybe 4 if you went to a very, very academic school, but really very focused. So you do that and you go into admitting based on people's predicted grades and interviews. Then they say, but that's going to favor people who do well in interviews. And by the way, there's a great variety in the ability of schools to coach even for these basic exams. So let's try to introduce stuff that finds people who've got raw talent who have been badly served by their schools. So we start trying to make allowances for the schools that people go to. I mean, people have always tried to do that. They've always tried to pick raw talent in the interviews. It's always an honest, open process. But then you start saying, but still people from certain backgrounds and certain schools do better. Well, of course, because some people have been brought up in families where they're just not given a very good education, and so on, and so on, and so on. And you move towards more and more attempts to remedy the balance. Not what I think you call it DEI in America. Not that, quite, not quotas, but constant attempts to and as you go down that track, everybody begins to think it's unfair. People who've done brilliantly at school, but it may be a good school, who do really well in their exams think it's unfair. People who do really badly because they come from a crappy school think it's unfair because they're not going to make it through the interview, and so on and so on and so on. So everybody starts complaining and cheating, trying to nudge themselves up. And it's not, again, this isn't exclusive to Britain, and it's not exclusive to DEI. Think about what happens with college admissions in the US, where people have to demonstrate that they've done 101 community activities of various sorts that they can put on there.
I had to.
They fill their quotas all over the place. Well, that's one way of doing it. A Cambridge director of admissions here said a few years ago, we don't care if you're Mother Teresa. All we want to know is whether you're going to be good at your subject when you come here, and that's all we're trying to test for.
That's certainly not the case in the US, I can tell you that.
It just varies, but the point is that there's no agreed standard of fairness. Once there's no agreed standard of fairness, instead of uniting people, this drive to higher education pits them against one another increasingly bitterly.
What you're describing is a kind of tragedy of the commons, right? Where you can have a higher ideal, but if people start defecting, then it doesn't work, right? It could be a traffic analogy or auto laws analogy. We can all agree to drive on the left side of the road here, and if there's people who start driving on the right, there's going to be a lot of accidents. People are going to die. I go ahead. Sorry.
The nice thing about tragedies of the commons is that they don't really happen. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago by showing that actually communities are very good at managing common pool resources. And they manage them through agreed custom and low-cost enforcement at a local level. But what really causes tragedies of the commons to occur is when you start introducing high-level regulation from outside. Because then nobody can enforce it at a local level. Nobody can enforce it informally. And you end up with
a charade. Yeah. Everyone knows that they're living within the system. It's like the Soviet two lives, right? There's the real life, and then there's
a very good anarchist writer, James C. Scott, an American anarchist writer, who has written beautifully about the way in which these he wrote a book called Seeing Like a State. And his analogy was...
Need a big pair of binoculars.
Yeah. You need a big pair of binoculars, but also you need what you then end up doing is not adapting to local realities. And the first example he gives in the book is German forestry in the 19th century.
Okay.
They planted all their trees in straight lines.
Right.
And they didn't get a proper mix. And they died in large numbers.
The trees
died in large numbers, yeah. It was all regimented and Prussian. And it didn't work. It's a very good book. He then goes after Le Corbusier and Le Corbusier architecture. And by implication, he goes after quite a lot of other, large-scale top-down schemes of social renewal. And there's a funny overlap between anarchist positions and conservative positions, actually. They start in a relatively similar place in trusting individual instincts, and then they shout at each other a lot, and then eventually they end up in the same place.
Well, I think a lot of politics at the end of the day ends up in the same place.
Ideologically it ends up in the same place. Anarchists, extreme anarchists and proper conservatives end up in quite similar positions.
The position that you're describing is not that different from a welfare state, I suppose. Well, so here's what's confusing to me that I'm sort of wrestling with as we talk about this. You've described how a top-down structure where you have a goal, you come up with a way of achieving that goal, and you attempt to impose that upon a big sample size, a vast population, maybe a whole empire, whatever, tends to not work and leads to this kind of charade because local enforcement is impossible. What you need is people on the ground in different municipalities and localities figuring out ways to get this done. Maybe not through the strict regulation, but finding creative ways based on their circumstances to get things done. So where I fall politically is that civil society, I think, should handle a lot of these problems. Your community, your religious communities, your family, your neighbors, whatever. I don't think that however noble the intention of some kind of welfare policy, that the government, will call it the federal government in the U.S. or, the crown, I suppose here, is capable or competent enough to implement on a large scale solutions which work in different localities.
No, but it often has to facilitate those local solutions because local communities may not have the resources to do some of the things that need to be done. And the other thing that you need, which you're missing out, I think, is that you need...
Me or America, or both?
You are missing out, is that I think you need a normative consensus that underpins what they do. And that normative consensus is all very well sometimes, but then can be very pernicious sometimes. I mean, most small villages, people hate one another. I mean, the notion of community, which was very fashionable a long time ago, is all very well, but communities can isolate people and can isolate minorities or, the unpopular person in the village.
Sure.
The witch.
Or the Jews.
Yeah.
Or anyone,
Yeah.
any other outcast group.
And they end up on a stake, or as a stake, depending on your attitude to cannibalism.
There's a great Montaigne essay on it's called De Cannibale about.
Right.
Are you familiar?
I know Montaigne. I don't know that is.
Well, the essay is basically recounts this guy who goes down to the Brazilian rainforest. This is late 16th century. I think it was like 1580s. This was published. He goes down to the Amazon and he sends like a dispatch to the Amazon, and he talks about all of the tribes like rituals and how it's a cannibalistic tribe and they eat each other. And as he's talking about like in a sort of systematic, like anthropological way, their customs, he's comparing them to the craziness of courtier life and of the Ancien regime and of European and specifically French custom. And at the end of the essay, there's this kind of the like the Volta, like the pithy line where he's like, so we see that in fact we are the savages, we are the barbarians,
Yep.
and they're the
There's a fun song by Flanders and Swan, which I recommend to you, called Eating People is Wrong, or The Reluctant Cannibal.
It's a shame that I wouldn't say irony has died, but that it's
Well, irony is something else that only really works in communities with relatively high normative agreement. I mean, I think it's very hard.
not contemporary UK or contemporary US.
Well, it still works in the UK, but I
do
suspect
you think people are too literal, or that's a normative question. Do you think that people are just descriptively more literal now than at some point in the past?
people at the moment are choosing to take offence. But I think it's always more difficult for a society with multiple cultural traditions like the US. I mean, where you've got people coming from all over the world to settle. And so there's not so much agreement. So it's easier to cause offence to somebody because you're going to tread on somebody or other's toes. I mean, there hasn't really been anybody since Tom Lehrer, excepting maybe, and surprisingly, South Park and all those ones, which are pretty biting and pretty ironical, actually. I don't know quite how they get away with it. I'm astonished that they're produced by Fox.
Produced by
Fox.
by Fox. There was definitely a few TV shows I used to quite like Californication. I don't know how ironic it is necessarily. It's sort of dramedy. It's moody and broody.
There's something very weird about New Yorker humor. I mean, it doesn't. The cartoons work, but the rest of it feels
it's
everything's
too
very
highbrow.
lengthy. Yeah.
Oh. Well, the New Yorker, I think, has become a kind of highbrow, expensive coffee shop, Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn. Brooklyn thing in the same way that the Paris Review after George Plimpton has, and a lot of these sort of last holdout magazines have. They're not necessarily doing like, gritty gonzo, whatever.
What's happened to the Harvard Lampoon? Does it still exist?
Yeah, the Harvard Lampoon exists.
Is it funny?
That's the last time I checked. I don't read it regularly as a
Is it funny?
Princeton Tiger.
Is it funny?
The last article I read in the Lampoon was funny, but this was from before you were born, Harold. So no. I think the Harvard Lampoon is still around, if I'm not mistaken. But I want to come back to housing for a second. We're still on question 1. Don't worry, we're not going to get through all of this. This is going all over the place, as it should. I think rightly so. Housing. Are you familiar with the Singapore housing model, at least vaguely?
I'm vaguely familiar with it, yeah.
I'm also very vaguely familiar with it. Or even just how Singapore is governed today. Well, let's just stay with housing for a second. Singapore, I think, has created a housing system which does not allow for ghettoization or particular ethnic communities to cluster in certain neighborhoods and to fence themselves off and to sort of self-segregate. I don't know exactly how it works, but you have people from the public housing is quite robust, I think, in Singapore. And mind you, Singapore is
What do you
quite
mean by
small.
robust? I mean,
There's a lot of it.
there's an awful lot of it, and it's very good quality.
Yes.
And it's going after all sorts of social classes.
Yes.
But
That's
that
what
is-
I mean.
But it's a small place, and you don't have, effectively speaking, land values might make it totally impossible to have the sort of housing market that you've got in the US or the UK.
Sure. So perhaps it's not, we
I think
can't
it's- I
extract
think-
portable lessons
I
from
think
it.
you can't extract anything from that. It's very unlike.
What if you did it on a local basis?
And Scotland had about 60% social housing at one point, and that did not stop segregation. It just meant a lot of people were living in social housing.
I don't know that.
If you're starting as a very poor community with very poor housing, and you engage in collective action, then rented housing is probably the way you're going to go. But I just don't know what's going to happen in terms of struggles about access to that. The question is, what happens when you run into scarcity, and who gets priority?
Well, we have scarcity, and I think that one of the big issues is that, or at least for young people, is this idea that they can't own their homes. Yep. Now, I am of the belief that people shouldn't be necessarily wanting to own their homes, and that the dream of home ownership is frankly quite silly. In the same way that wanting to buy a new car every couple of years, I think, is completely ridiculous. Now, I don't drive much, and I know people like things. People have tastes and whatever. I'm not saying we should just have one uniform mass manufactured automobile that everyone gets. But to me, four wheels and a braking system is enough to get you where you're going. And okay, some have more safety features. But for housing, yes, people have to live in these things. They want to have a good quality of life. And I haven't spent extensive amounts of time thinking about this, but I've lived in Australia, I've lived in the States, I'm living here in the UK now. Everywhere I go, you hear the same story of young people sort of being upset that they can't own homes in the same way that their parents could.
Well, you've probably got to distinguish between housing as a financial asset and housing as somewhere to
as
live.
A roof.
And the problem is that it's taken off as a financial asset.
Yeah.
And
extremely speculative financial asset.
And that's for a number of reasons. The first reason is that the 60s and 70s generated incredibly high rates of inflation. So housing was a one-way bet for anyone who borrowed money to buy a house, because the value of your debt went down pretty close to zero within about 10, 15 years. And the value of your asset in nominal pounds or dollars rocketed. And that was particularly true in the UK. So it was a one-way bet. What's more, it was a one-way bet that was assisted by very generous tax treatment of housing.
Sure. First-time home.
Yeah. So you ended up with that, with, as it were, your parents' generation having the apparent, it was an apparent one-way ticket. You had to buy a house because it was the way you got financial security. So that's quite apart from what was happening to houses as places to live. And I think the second vicious spiral that's happened to housing as a financial asset starts with the 87 stock market crash and the way the Fed pumps money into the global economy, and goes through the 2001-2 crash, and goes through each successive crash where the Fed has pumped money in and other central banks have followed their example, so that you've had basically free money driving up asset prices worldwide. It's not just houses, it's silly bits of abstract art, it's fine wines, it's gold, it's all sorts of stuff is trading at way, way, way above its use value, if you want to use this old Marxist distinction between use value and exchange value. So that's, I think, what is needed to solve that problem is a crash in asset prices. The snag is that creates all sorts of other problems, as we've discovered, which is why the Fed and the Bank of England and all these other central banks always move in to prop up collapsing markets.
It sounds quite cyclical based on your description.
Well, I think it's cyclical, but we haven't let the cycles happen.
You think we should let,
I don't know. I don't have a policy prescription for this because we're now so financialized that, and our financial system is so tied to asset prices. Something like 70 to 80% of global advances, bank advances, according to Adair Turner's relatively recent book, The Debt and the Devil, are property related one way or another. So if property prices collapse, the banking system goes. If the banking system goes, the economy goes. On the other hand, while it's like it is, nobody can buy a house. It's absurd. And people think that people who own houses are incredibly rich. Government's probably about to go and tax them. But actually, it's still the same modest two-bedroom house that they bought, 20 years ago, but now technically has a market value. If they sold it, however,
more than £1 million.
if they sold it, they'd have to buy something else.
And they have to pay taxes on
and
the
you
sale.
have to pay tax. I mean, it's an absolutely invidious situation that well-meaning attempts to rescue financial markets have got us into. Use value, I don't agree with you. I think people like owning their houses for perfectly sensible reasons, partly because it gives them security.
I'm not saying they should never own a house. Yeah. I'm saying young people can put their capital to use in other ways.
Yes, they can, but then you have to reckon that at some point you're going to want a house, and you probably have a hierarchy of values in which bringing up your family somewhere nice and safe and secure is a very high priority.
So when should you have? You need to have a house. I don't know that actually, frankly, if you need to own the house, but you need to have the house at such a time as you're going to bring children into the world.
You need to have, well, if you look at other European countries, Germany, people still rent a lot of housing.
But so what I'm concerned about, Harold, is a situation which is happening where people think that they need to have a house. They need to own a house, and they take loans on it that they're never going to be able to repay.
But the asset prices...
and then they're trapped in debt.
Yeah, but the asset prices spill over into rental prices. I mean, people are spending 60 or 70% of their income on rent. It's absurd.
I think
that's because land prices are very high, asset prices are very high.
This is tough because we don't want to artificially hold down rent prices because that leads to lots of
that will lead to shortages. I mean, that's about to happen in this country.
In New York, it's about to happen in New York.
Yeah. I mean, I think the solution to this, but it's a solution that carries its own pain, is another bout of rampant inflation.
What?
It devalues the debts.
I'll try pitching that to the Fed. I'll get Jerome on the phone.
It's not a there are lots of other reasons you wouldn't want to do it, but it's the only way, I think, that you can devalue the debts that people would have to take out in order to borrow the money to buy a house.
Well, aren't there other solutions that don't involve chopping down rainforest, like building more housing or creating...
The thing is people have to be able to afford to buy the houses that you're building. And
no, I'm saying they shouldn't have to own them. Can't we have affordable renting? How do we have affordable houses that are affordable to rent that...
You could have a very large social housing. I mean, a very large social housing.
I don't want the government too involved.
If you want private investors to do it, they have to make a return on it, and you're back in the same bind.
Maybe we have an NGO do it. I don't know.
Well, that's what happens in Britain. There are lots of NGOs. I mean, the state doesn't directly provide housing anymore. It gives it to housing associations.
Or we could build up instead of out, but then we don't want skyscrapers.
Well, in any way, given the space that people want to put around skyscrapers, there's been a lot of research that demonstrates you can get roughly the same densities by turning the skyscrapers on their side and calling them out terraced housing. There's a lot of research that shows that.
And it looks nicer.
High building, much nicer. I mean, high buildings are crap if you've got small children.
Why?
Because they can't go outside and play.
Fair enough. Right? They play on the terrace. Have a big fence.
Yeah. I mean, the terraced house probably has a garden behind it with small children. That's great. If you're in a reasonably safe, low-traffic neighborhood, when they're a bit bigger, they can probably go out and play with their friends in a local park. Once you're in a high-rise, and you end up with all these unowned spaces that become the space. I mean, we've been there.
Space for money laundering.
Yeah, and we've been there. We've been there and tried that, and it was disastrous.
I think actually we're still...
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, Britain went through a phase of high-rise building, really,
Empty.
in which government tried to encourage it, social housing, in the 60s. They subsidized it enormously heavily. And, we've spent the last 20 years blowing those places up and
Is that
replacing them
like
with low-rise.
figuratively or literally?
No,
With TNT?
literally, with TNT, yeah.
What do you mean? In central London?
Yeah.
Why? Where? What?
Well, because
why do you make
nobody
them in
wants to
office
live in
buildings?
them. Because nobody wants to live in them. Because they leak. Because the cladding falls off. Because they're dangerous.
Right.
Because the rain comes through. Because they're awful. Nobody wants to live in them, and they are dangerous. On the whole, they tend to be clustered on estates that, in themselves, have been dangerous places. Become dangerous places.
So, is this course you teach, Death of a Dream, an eschatology course, or a course about hope?
It's neither. It's an object lesson to people who want to go into politics, which is a lot of the people that I teach, about how jolly difficult it is that you set out with good intentions and things don't turn out the way you expect. And I think this applies just as much to, free market enthusiasts like you as it does to, rabid left-wingers from the 1940s. It's just not going to turn out the way you think it is. And that's the essence of the British conservative tradition, if you like, as against the sort of free market libertarian tradition, which is to be in favor of social amelioration, but be very careful about unintended consequences.
I'm in favor of social amelioration. I think, like you, I'm concerned about how we actually achieve it.
Yeah. Well, cautiously is the answer. Somebody called Stephen Weil, who I knew at Cambridge, talked about what he called the social egg theory.
The social egg theory.
Yeah. And he said, society's like an egg.
You get beans and toast with that?
Yeah, you do. Well, that's when it goes wrong, because you break the egg. He said trying to change society is like moving an egg, push it gently. Don't break the egg. You can get the egg where you want, but push it too hard and too fast, and it'll break.
What if the people start doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, like persecuting minorities?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, the first of these Scruton lectures, Oakeshott lectures, was precisely about that. And Noel Malcolm, who is very clever and a good guy, was putting forward a very similar argument to Jonathan Sumption in the Reith lectures a few years ago against entrenching human rights in constitutions, because it encourages absolutist solutions rather than the sort of compromises that politics generates.
One back. I know this is not your position that you're talking about, the position of Jonathan Sumption and Noel Malcolm. The idea is that filling a constitution with human rights guarantees is bad because it leads to absolutist solutions. Help me break that down.
Okay.
I know this is not your position, but what is this argument?
Sumption's argument is, which I think is clearer probably than Noel's argument, though they're both good. Sumption's argument in the Reith lectures is that if you entrench human rights provisions, for example, the supposed right to abortion or not right to abortion in the US, depending which way the court has gone on any particular day of the week, you've got a problem, because what happens is that you end up having an argument that tends to go one way or the other way. And also you end up with activist courts that are always tempted to push it out a bit further and a bit further and a bit further. And you see that Sumption gives the example of the European Convention on Human Rights, where the right to family life has been pushed a very, very long way. In terms of, for example, there's a recent case not cited by Sumption, in which somebody who was a violent criminal who'd been abusing one of his children was prevented from being deported on the grounds of his right to family life. He wanted to be able to be close to his daughter. Well, that is
the daughter who he was abusing.
The daughter he'd been abusing, yes.
Right.
Now, I may be misquoting that case, but I don't think I am. And there have been relatively, there have been a lot of cases where human rights have been pushed to a point at which probably they weren't intended by the people who were framing the European Convention, and a lot of the rights in the US Bill of Rights have probably been pushed to an extent that the framers didn't intend them to be. So then you get an argument between strict constructionists, or whatever they're called in the US, who believe that you should go back to the intentions of the founding fathers in the way in which the court makes its judgment, and people who say that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in particular should be regarded as a living instrument and should be allowed to adapt. Now, if you take the example of both abortion and civil rights in the States, both of those have been pushed by the court through the 60s and 70s, largely because the legislature was incapable of coming to solutions. There was an obvious need for society to change, but you just couldn't get it through the Congress. And that's one of the things that very good book about Lyndon Johnson is so strong on. You know the one that I mean, what's he called? Huge biographer of...
Oh, Caro?
Caro, yeah. So
well,
Caro,
there's 3.
Yeah. Caro shows, well, 4, I think.
4 volumes,
4 volumes, yeah. Caro shows very well how difficult it was to get any of that stuff through the Congress. So the court ended up stepping into the void and, as it were, moving American society in roughly the direction in which perhaps eventually a majority of Americans wanted it to go. Though, of course, there were holdouts in the southern states who didn't want it to go that way. But because it's the court doing it, it's always, well, first of all, it can always be reversed by a subsequent court. But secondly, there's no feeling that it's the people doing this. It's a bunch of wise people. It's Platonic guardians doing this on your behalf. Whereas Assumption gives the example of abortion reform in the in the UK, which came in as a limited right in a private member's bill in the House of Commons, put forward by David Steele, who was leader of the Liberal Party, but goes through the House of Commons on a free vote, which means that it's not whipped, gets through with loads and loads of provisions restricting abortion around it, and then very gradually gets extended by amending legislation. But very gradually. And it's just not a controversial issue in the UK. Now, whatever you think about the rights and wrongs of abortion, I mean, if you take a religious position on this, you'll say, but it should be a key issue. But the great majority of the population probably don't take a religious position on it. Particularly the UK is not a particularly religious country, but even the US is pretty likely more religion. But it doesn't become a divisive issue. Whereas in American politics, it has become a catastrophically divisive issue. So the argument is that human rights legislation, human rights entrenchment, once it starts being extended, really risks not carrying a democratic consensus with it. And because of that, you begin to get rebellions against it.
But that's okay, I suppose, but
if the
you want to entrench rights and then people decide.
Well, but the rights are always, I mean, there's this thing called an essentially contested concept. It's a philosophical idea.
Sure.
It's something that people they're just never going to agree on. And many of these rights, as specified, are essentially contested concepts. They can be read in lots of different ways. What you want is a process that doesn't go in the direction of absolutist interpretations of that, but can be flexible. Because
why do you want that?
Why do you want that? Because otherwise you end up with the elites polarized against the masses, and you end up with the election of Marine Le Pen in France, let us say, or Mr. Trump in the United States, and I hope not Mr. Farage here. You don't want a polarized society. I mean, you really don't. For all the reasons I was talking about earlier, particularly the fact that societies need to be relatively consensual and high trust in order to be able to function at all. And once they start polarizing, you lose that.
Is there a way to stop polarization? I mean, Rene Girard would point
Do you mean
the
to
scapegoat
reverse
mechanism.
it or to stop it?
Yeah, either to solve the problem of polarization, an issue agnostic way.
I would have thought that
We can't just bugger on. I mean, we have religiously, we have the 10 Commandments, and I think people generally try to adhere to this. But if we didn't have entrenched rights to, for example, private property, I could just go, take your glasses because I like them.
You can have laws. There's a difference between laws and entrenched rights.
Yeah.
The point is that you shouldn't have too much stuff that depends on the judges rather than the legislature.
Who should be humans and not robots. But that's another topic.
Well,
that's like AI judges.
Yeah, well, but you don't, whether they're humans or robots, you want your laws to be made by and capable of being changed by the people in a society. You probably do want to have entrenched rights, but I think the way that I would want to view those entrenched rights would be as another form of checks and balances. They are not God-given. They're constructs, and they have to be capable of amendment and change through the legislature, and you don't want to make that quasi-impossible. And the snag is, in the States, it's very difficult to change them unless you appoint judges from your side to the court, which is what's happening at the moment.
To the High Court, to the Supreme Court.
To Supreme Court, yeah. And in Europe, it's virtually impossible to change it because effectively nobody controls the Court of Human Rights, which was set up by the Council of Europe, which is an intergovernmental body. But getting enough agreement between the bodies that set it up to amend it isn't probably possible, and the court, I think, by now would resist the notion that it could be changed by the Council of Europe, even if you could conceivably get consensus in that body. I mean, there are various attempts now by various European governments to amend the way in which the Court of Human Rights, European Court of Human Rights, interprets things, particularly when it comes to refugee conventions. And they may succeed because it's such a hot political issue in all of the countries, but it will be very difficult.
You talked before about transforming people, and this sort of grand project, not just of making the world better, but of this transformation, which would occur concurrently with this, or as a result of this, or after this. Could you elaborate a little on what you mean by this?
I think it was well-meaning Christian idealism, effectively. I mean,
transform them from what to what, if the assumption is that they are good, make them more good, more altruistic, more
the assumption was
sharing.
That if you take away the things that are making them bad, like poor housing or poor education or whatever, then the good bits of them will come to the fore. The assumption was that some of the things you don't like in human behavior, many of the things you don't like in human behavior, are caused by the adverse material conditions or the injustice or the inequality within which they find themselves. And that's a reasonable set of assumptions.
I think those exacerbate. But anyway, to give me, I'm sorry to have interrupted. Give me the full thinking. So if you alleviate...
It wasn't a thinking, it was a feeling. It was... Remember that most of these people...
This was an entrenched feeling.
It was an entrenched feeling about human potential being thwarted and about human potential being released by taking away adverse. And it was an optimism about what human potential would be like if it was released. And that comes in two flavors, if you like. The continental flavor is very often a Marxist one, in which you're talking about alienation, and you're talking about what unalienated man would be like. And then you go back to Marx's 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, or some of the thinking around those. I mean, not to those, because European political parties weren't really aware of those until pretty recently. But lurking around somewhere in the back of Marx is the notion that human nature is grossly distorted by exploitative relations, and that when you end exploitation, then human beings can reach their full potential. And it all comes sort of vaguely out of Hegel. And I think it's a lot of nonsense. So that's, I'm bad at defending that one. I think but that really wasn't important in the British tradition that I'm talking about. The British tradition was based on very specific bits of British history, the notion of fair play and decent treatment and treating people as gentlemen, which grows up right through the 19th century and is very important, not just in the independent schools, the public schools, but right through society. The notion of a fair fight. You get into an argument with somebody in a pub, and you go outside and you take off your jackets and you settle your fight like gentlemen with fists. And, only a dastardly foreigner would pull a knife under those circumstances. So fair play right through sport and all sorts of things is a very, very important underlying notion. The Christian notion of equality of souls is a very, very important notion. A lot of the British working class socialism comes out of Methodism. It comes through the Liberal Party. I mean, Methodists go into the Liberal Party, and then they move towards social reform based on a view of human potential which is broadly Christian and optimistic. It's releasing the better angels of your nature, as Lincoln put it. And you get something very similar for the strand that comes out of the independent schools, which is actually most of the authors of the post-1945 settlement, people like Attlee, Prime Minister, who, when Prime Minister, used to go back to his old public school. His Labour Prime Minister used to go back to his old independent school. Very proud of it. He was very proud of the number of people from his school rather than Eton who were in his cabinet. It's not quite as simple as everybody thinks. People present it as if 1945 was working class triumph, which it was. I mean, the last strand of this was the trades unions, who backed Labour at a solid local level. But there it was again, the notion that it would be local leaders, often Methodist preachers, who would become city fathers and try and remove the worst of conditions. Because it's obvious to them that if you give people education, they're going to want to read good books. If you give them decent housing, they're going to want to keep it clean, and so on and so on and so on. It's an inchoate optimism. It's not
what's the word?
Inchoate optimism.
What does inchoate mean?
It means not fully formed, baggy at the edges. Optimism, a woolly optimism.
You've been a consultant, an academic, and a political candidate, a political activist, operative. Which of those has taught you the most about human nature?
Well, about human nature, I don't know. Being a parent taught me the most about human nature.
That wasn't on the list of options there, Harold.
No, it wasn't.
What has taught you the most? What has each, if you could distill it to a sentence, in business, academia, politics, taught you about human nature? Maybe different sides.
I think politics teaches you more about human nature than those other things. It's involved in everything, I suppose. Yeah, being a strategy consultant, you're abstracting some elements of what you're doing. I think being a historian teaches you a lot about human nature. So being an academic as such doesn't teach you anything about human nature, excepting that academics can be just as small-minded and bitchy as any other small village community.
I think it might come with the job description.
Yeah, or as charming and engaging as any other village community.
Right.
But it's a village community, and academics behave like a village. But I think history teaches you a vast amount about human nature. I mean, that's why I'm a historian, and that's why I teach history.
If you could sit down with your 25-year-old self, what would you tell him sitting across from him on these couches?
Shut up.
Stop talking, keep your mouth shut, and listen. Learn
More
from
than I
other
do.
people. More than you do. Well, hey, you were president of the union back in the day.
Yeah.
Um,
So that does involve not talking, of course, because you're organizing the debates.
yes, and taking notes. And
Yeah.
getting your early introduction to politics. I was gonna wrap things up, but why not have something a bit spicy at the end? Is the NHS a success story?
Yes. An overwhelming success story. I mean, it's unbelievable how good it is. And of course, sometimes things go wrong, and of course there are waiting lists. But if you look at health outcomes in the UK, they are very good indeed for a very small expenditure by comparison. Certainly in the US, we spend about half as much on healthcare as you do in the United States, and we get much, much better outcomes at population level. In some specialties, the NHS is world-beating. There are lots of things that it's very, very good. One of the advantages of it is precisely because it's national. You can do things like the huge genome sequencing of the entire population that's happening at the moment. It's very good as a base for research. I mean, we're coming up with fabulous
Why
things.
would you need to genome sequence an entire population?
Because you can
it
then
sounds like that data could be used for all kinds of nefarious...
No, because you can then use that to see what's happening, what's causing particular diseases. It's not used for nefarious purposes.
Well, you would hope.
It just isn't, wouldn't be.
Not by the NHS,
Yeah.
but by whoever gets their hands on the data.
Well, I think it is true that we are using Palantir to analyze some of the US data.
Well, Harold, you just answered my concern there.
No,
you don't know where it's going.
We know very well where it's going. It's incredibly heavily. This is one of the things Britain is also very good at is cybersecurity. And GCHQ and the US are the two leading cybersecurity organizations in the world. So
there's an old,
we're good at that.
There's an old joke. Americans innovate. Asians imitate, Europeans regulate.
Yes, but in this case, that's not true.
In the cybersecurity space.
That's absolutely not true in cybersecurity space. NSA and GCHQ work hand in glove, and they are very good at it.
Harold, what is your favorite book and your favorite movie?
Favorite book, Winnie the Pooh.
I like Winnie the Pooh.
Favorite movie, Casablanca.
It's a good one. We'll always have Paris.
Yeah, no, it's the point at which they stand up and sing the Marseillaise. It's pretty good.
That was a heartwarming moment. Casablanca sticks with me because I question at the end whether Rick's decision was the right decision insofar as there can be a right decision in such a dastardly circumstance. She comes back to Casablanca. Rick has the opportunity to abscond with her at the expense of her lover who's running the French resistance. He knows that she will not leave without him, and so he basically tricks her into getting on the plane and absconding with her current lover rather than him, even though he's still in love with her, for
but of
the
course,
good of France, the freedom of Europe, what he believes is right, but it's a tough and then we want to celebrate him as a hero because it's comes at such a great cost to himself. He sacrifices love. Of course, the argument could also be made that because he loves her so much, that's why he lets her go.
No, I think the argument is, I think it's all about chivalry. It's all about, it's just straight Arthurian stuff. That's what one of the knights of the
That the other guy came first.
No, it's the other guy is what is needed for the good of humanity, for the good of the cause.
Not for the good of her, for the good of the resistance.
For the good of the cause. I'm not sure it's clear he's the resistance leader. I think he's an intellectual.
I think he's a resistant.
Maybe.
Is he not? Okay, so you're saying Rick's.
He is somebody who will make a difference to the outcome of the war.
So the calculation is not based upon giving his lover what is good for her. It's based on having this guy make a difference to the war, which Rick has his side on.
Of course. And it's Rick getting off the fence. You've forgotten that actually the last
Most people
scene,
spend their lives on the fence.
No,
they have to make a decision.
The last scene is not that. The last scene is him and the corrupt cop.
Yeah, saying
going off
this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
To join the Free French. Or to join the Allies.
Is it?
Yep.
Well, they're walking, they're smoking cigarettes on the tarmac, and he says, I think it's Louis, and Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Yep.
But they're both then going to join the Free French?
I think that's obvious, yeah.
In Morocco?
It doesn't matter. I mean, in
I think it does.
Wherever the local campaign is. I can't remember when that was filmed, but it's a propaganda film. It's about getting off the fence and coming down on the right side.
It was filmed after the war. It must have.
Was it?
I think so.
I don't know.
I could be wrong. I think it was 50.
I may be wrong. But it was still a propaganda film about doing the right thing.
For the cause.
For the cause, yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you very much.